Good afternoon, folks. The Canadian Constitution is a beautiful thing. It's about freedom and fairness. And one of the most beautiful things about our Constitution are the charter rights, basically the human rights that we have here in Canada, and how those things like the freedom to worship the way that we want to, the freedom to assemble with whoever we want to associate with, the freedom of speech, how those things are protected by the highest law of the land. Now, of course, in order to get the constitutional deal that repatriated our Constitution, the notwithstanding clause was brought into place. Now, Section 33 was initially presented to Canadians as a pressure release valve in a hypothetical case of an activist judiciary, where you, the people, by exercising your votes to elect a legislature or a parliament, would be able to stand up for the rights of a vulnerable minority against that sort of overreach. However, what we've seen over the past few years in particular in Canada is exactly the opposite. The notwithstanding clause is routinely being used by politicians who are targeting vulnerable minorities, targeting the LGBTQ2S+ communities, targeting religious people. Bill 21 from Quebec is certainly one that many of us have heard about. We know that Muslim organizations, Sikh organizations, people who believe in the religious freedoms of a Christian to be able to wear a cross, a crucifix, have been speaking out about this bill. And so the Quebec situation is certainly top of mind. But we also know that other provinces, like our neighbors to the west, in the prairies, have used this to target LGBT folks. And that's not right. That's not who we are as Canadians. We are a society that's about pluralism. It's about people living together. And so the thing that I say to somebody who asks, when I visit a Hutterite colony, how do I feel about LGBT rights, is the same thing that I say here in the city when somebody asks, what am I going to do to stand up for the lonely trans child who's being picked on in a classroom? What I say is this: our system of human rights in Canada is absolutely essential, because the same charter that protects that person to live out their experience, their gender reality, is the same right that protects the Hutterite person, that protects the Sikh, that protects the Muslim, to be able to protect their faith and practice their faith here in Canada. And so, being at the table with the other premiers, of course, we've talked about some of these issues in the notwithstanding clause, but today here in Manitoba, we introduced Bill 50. Now, I'm committing to everybody here that our government will never use the notwithstanding clause in Manitoba during our time in office, and the reason is simple: because we respect human rights as they are articulated in the Charter. We're bringing in this law today to ensure that no future government in Manitoba can use the notwithstanding clause without being straight up with you. This bill will ensure that if Section 33 is ever used to push through a law in Manitoba, that future government would have to go to the courts and have the courts rule if people's rights would be violated, were it not for the use of Section 33. And then at the end of the day, it's up to you. Armed with that information, that potentially a future government in Manitoba might be trampling on people's rights, it will be up to you, the voter, to decide if you want to support that government the next time you go to the ballot box. So we've got a complicated constitutional, legal history in Canada in many, many dimensions. But at the end of the day, what it always returns to is you, the people. This is a democracy. And through all the imperfections and ups and downs of politicians and the other branches of government, in a democracy, it should always be up to you. And so Manitoba is bringing forward to this Canadian debate right now on the use of Section 33 and the notwithstanding clause the perspective that, yeah, it's a reality, one that I don't agree with, but a reality of our current constitutional landscape. But at the end of the day, we should formalize its use in this country to put the power back in your hands, the voting public, so that you can decide what's fair, what's not fair, whose freedoms are being trampled on, and most importantly, whose liberties are being exercised.
Question? So
Yeah.
if judges still would not have the authority to overturn a bill, so the aim of this proposal is that governments, voters would know that governments are violating rights that would otherwise be protected.
Exactly. I think if you tell the average person out there that a government's using the notwithstanding clause, that might not resonate. But if the average person out there hears that rights are being stepped on, I think that hits a little closer to home. All of us as Manitobans, whether you're from the Francophone community, the Indigenous community, the Ukrainian community, the list goes on right through everybody's collective backgrounds, we all have a story of when we were the persecuted ones. And so this is really just in keeping with that history that we have collectively of Manitobans and saying, you know what, we need to speak out for the vulnerable minority in our society today because more than likely we've experienced that in our families in the past, and to hopefully safeguard our kids and grandkids in the future.
Manitoba's made its presentation for the Supreme Court on this matter. So why do this now? I mean, don't we trust the Supreme Court to make a ruling that will have impact here?
Yeah, of course, I think the Supreme Court is going to resolve this in the appropriate way. But it's time in Canada that we push back against what conservative politicians are doing, right? You know, I'm just going to call it out. It's always the right wing that's using the notwithstanding clause, and they're using it to play wedge politics. And however you feel about trans rights, however you feel about a Muslim person praying in the street, as Mr. Legault is trying to allege is happening in Quebec a ton, the reality is this: we need to respect people's freedoms. And I would go a step further and say Canadians don't like things that are mean-spirited. And these laws that are being brought in are clearly mean-spirited. When people play wedge politics about somebody's identity, whether that's gender or whether that's your religion or your culture, to me that's mean. And I don't like that. And so a lot of ink has been spilled and headlines have been written articulating the conservative right-wing partisan perspective, which I would argue is actually inconsistent with the basic principles of conservatism generally. Small government, individual freedoms, the government getting out of the way of people to be who they are. And I think it's time for us to have the moderate perspective, which is, while Section 33 might exist in our Constitution, in terms of having a free society, having the ability for every kid out there to grow up and be who they want to be, we need to have some practical contours put around this thing. And so this is a different argument than what the federal government's doing, right? Like the federal government's going to the Supreme Court and they're arguing for the court maybe to set up this parameter. What I'm saying is no. Let's respect the existing Constitution as it is. The politicians do their thing, let the judges do their thing and weigh in, and then at the end of the day, who's it up to? It should be up to you, the voting public. And it might take a few years for that next ballot box day to roll around. Didn't say that as pretty as I wanted to. It might take a few years for the next election day to roll around. But at the end of the day, you should have the information. You should have that clarity that, maybe a law was stepping on people's rights. Maybe people's freedoms were being taken advantage of for political purposes. And so for me, what can I contribute alongside our government to the national conversation? Well, I can tell you we're not going to use Section 33 in Manitoba because I don't think that aligns with our values here in this province and the freedoms that we cherish and the history that we have together. I can tell you that we're going to bring this law forward to hopefully put in place a legal framework, but also to have the public debate and have people tell us at committee and in the public sphere, do you agree with this idea that people ought to know whether a bill would be unconstitutional otherwise, were it not for Section 33? And then most importantly, you know, as with all things in our democracy, it's to continue to try and push this debate towards a real conversation about who we are as Canadians. Because I noticed a lot of my colleagues around the Premier's table want to have the conversation when it's about trans rights. They want to have the conversation when it's about unions. They want to have the conversations when it's about a Muslim person praying in the street. But when you talk about your human rights, nobody wants to have that conversation. But that's what it is. We have human rights codes, and we have these various acts that recognize those things at the provincial level, at the federal level. But how are our human rights most fundamentally enshrined? It's in the parts of the charter that Section 33 can override. And so, partisanship aside, I'm taking shots at conservative politicians in this commentary here, sure. But ask yourself fundamentally, do you think it's appropriate for a government to suspend human rights? I think there are very, very few Canadians who would agree with it's okay for a government to suspend human rights. And so what I'm trying to do through this bill, what our government is trying to do through the actions that we're bringing to this public debate, is to return it to that question. Do Canadians agree with the suspension of human rights? And then maybe we'll have some of the related conversations about, do you agree with the suspension of human rights for the purposes of doing wedge politics or of trying to boost your polling numbers?
So if there's only 8 sitting days left and this bill is not likely to pass, can you explain the timing of this? Is this to be part of the national conversation to get the attention from other premiers and be on the national stage, or is this really about passing legislation for Manitobans?
We passed a bill last week, so we do want this bill passed. I'd say also this bill is being introduced within a national context in which we've heard many of my colleagues as premiers argue that Section 33 should be left alone and that legislatures and the Parliament should be allowed to use Section 33. And I think for our Canadian public debate to be as strong as it ought to be, we need to have that more moderate perspective, which is that, yeah, Section 33 is a constitutional reality, but in order to respect the freedoms of the average person out there, the rights of the average person, we need to have some practical rules of engagement when it comes to the notwithstanding clause.
The opposition raised some questions about the value per dollar that we're getting for Mr. Madden in Washington. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to respond.
Well, first, I think it's important anytime the PCs raise this topic for Manitobans to be reminded that they closed and cut our presence in DC. So not having a presence in America as Donald Trump was on his march into office, that's the approach of the PC party. Their current leader took $500,000 shortly before running for office from the provincial government of the day. Was there any value for money of that? I'll leave it to Manitobans to go look at the business leaders who criticized the decision at the time and said there was not a value there. But when I talk about Richard Madden, the guy's great. The guy's got the smarts, he's got the look, he's got the connections in DC to be able to advocate for our province. And we have this amazing story to tell as Manitobans. Abundant, low-cost energy during the AI boom, critical minerals at the time that America and the whole world is trying to rearm. We've got a smart, educated workforce, a low, affordable cost of living. We have all these huge competitive advantages, and we need to make that case to the Trump administration that doing business with us is good for your country, just as it is good for our country. And Mr. Madden is a storyteller who can make that case. So the strategy that he is being brought on board as part of, and by the way, the presence at the Canadian Embassy, I think, is live as of November as part of this initiative. It goes back to the election, right? We brought on Gary Dewar as an unpaid advisor. I think there was a lot of value in that. Everybody would probably agree, getting a former ambassador and former premier who knows senators and administration people on board for free. It's pretty good. And then we took delegations down to the U.S. And now what we heard actually from business leaders in Manitoba is the delegation model is good as an introduction. But you need a permanent full-time presence, otherwise people leave you people forget you as soon as you leave the door. And so having a permanent presence there, it's really about making sure that when the Manitoba beef producers, the agricultural producers, the manufacturers, the aerospace folks, when they show up in Washington, D.C., that they have their person on the ground who's going to be opening the doors, who's going to be able to put them in front of media in the D.C. media ecosystem and really make that case and tell that story about Manitoba, because we have to make the case heading into the automatic review of CUSMA next year, 2026, at a bunch of levels, right? This is our most important trade deal. This is what protects a lot of our exports from tariffs under Donald Trump right now. That's big for the ag sector. That's big for a lot of manufacturers. So we really need to maintain those exemptions as part of the 2026 CUSMA review. How do you do that? Well, you need to make sure that that average congressperson from Iowa understands the value of pork coming from Manitoba, the weanlings in particular in that case. You need the South Dakota senator to be reminded of the deep interconnections across our cattle industries. You need that state level representative who is maybe complaining about wildfire smoke this summer to remember that manufacturers headquartered in Manitoba employ hundreds of people in their districts. And at the end of the day, we're talking to an audience of one as well. There's one person in the Oval Office right now that we're trying to get our story in front of. And so making the case with those state and Senate folks, making the case with the administration, making the case with the president, it's all part of the work that Mr. Madden has taken on. And this is a huge, huge value to our province. It's an important investment. Well, it's a negotiation.
Was there any talk of setting performance targets, or is there any benchmarks?
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about what's expected, what's measurable?
Well, I think success from our perspective is to ensure that the CUSMA exemption is maintained and that we remove the other tariffs put on Manitoba products. Nobody else has been able to do that, right? Keir Starmer couldn't do that. Emmanuel Macron couldn't do that. Mark Carney, I hope he's successful, so far hasn't been able to do that. But that's a high bar, and that's how we're measuring success. And that's the goal that we have Mr. Madden hired towards achieving for Manitoba. No, everything. Steel, we got Selkirk, we've got West Steel, we've got all these steel producers in Manitoba. We got pork where we want to talk about China. So again, I'll be going to Ottawa next week to meet with the Prime Minister, and among many important topics, I'll be talking about all the pressures that the ag industry is under, right? And you have the immigration cuts, you got the Chinese tariffs, you got the Trump tariff threats, you've got the threat of epidemic disease in the ag industry and all sorts of other things. So we need to work together as Team Canada, and Mr. Madden will definitely make the case on pork to the audience that cares about that, which in DC happens to mostly be the Iowa Congressional Caucus. And then he's going to run across the hall and make the case to the representatives from Washington about our aerospace industry and how that helps the state of Washington and so on and so forth. So again, we've got to invest in Manitoba to Trump-proof our economy. And Mr. Madden is one of the important emissaries to help carry that message and to action the negotiations leading to the 2026 CUSMA review. He lives in the States, so he's being paid in American. I didn't get into this for money. When we think about trade with the U.S., we're talking about billions of dollars, tens of thousands of jobs in Manitoba. And the Trump administration has thrown all that into chaos. And so for us, this has been a huge part of our priority since before even coming into office, was trying to lay the groundwork for a successful review of CUSMA in 2026. We've had a lot of help along the way. Shout out to our business community. Shout out to the bankers who work with us on the treasury side of things here in the province. Shout out to the average Manitoban out there who's been supporting the liquor being off the store shelves and stuff like that. But one consistent area that was identified was we need a permanent presence. And this is the cost of doing business in Trump's America. And this is a cost that maybe would have been a little lower if the PCs hadn't closed the office. But this is definitely an investment that we have to make to protect our economy from Donald Trump. Yes.
code and beefing up RCMP staffing and pay to recruits. I believe the allowance they get like $500 something to $1,000. I just want to get overall your response.
Well, we've done a lot on bail and keeping people safe in the streets. We've added 3 dozen police officers in Winnipeg, added funding for RCMP positions, ankle bracelets, direction to Crown prosecutors, making sure that we're building new facilities like a new justice facility in the city of Dauphin to be able to keep you safe. You know, part of that has been reaching out to our federal partners and saying that we need to work together on this. So it's encouraging to hear some of the announcements today. I hope it's going to make a difference. And I hope that the steps we're taking are going to continue making a difference. The reality is, the test at the end of the day is whether you feel safer after these changes come into place. So I'm hopeful, but I fully recognize that there's a whole heck of a lot more work to do when we're talking about safety.
One of the items that was announced today was working funding more to get at the root causes of crime. Defense lawyers say that's going to make probably more of a difference than tweaks to the criminal code and probably bail reform later. You know, we'll remain to be seen how they play out in court, but that is where the difference lies in causes of crime. Does that give you any hope for big changes?
I think the average Manitoban understands that you have to tackle the causes of crime at the same time that you tackle crime itself. And that's how we've been approaching things here in Manitoba. At the same time that we've added police officers, we funded the Universal School Nutrition Program. But the reality is, you can't bring the school milk cart to a robbery that's in progress. You need a police officer to do that. And you need a justice system to hold that person responsible, accountable. And so the reality of the world that we live in is I wish we didn't need to do these things because there was no crime. Unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. So we're going to tackle the root causes. I'm encouraged to see the federal government signal that they're going to invest there as well. But we need bail reform. We need to be able to hold people accountable. We need law enforcement to keep people safe. That is a comprehensive approach, and it is a comprehensive approach that's needed if we want to make you safer in the future. And one more thing, which is we're very happy to announce that our target of 800 surgeries in Selkirk of the fiscal year, March to the end of next March, we're halfway there. 402 surgeries as of today. So for people in Selkirk, the Interlake, people right across Manitoba, fixing healthcare is priority number one. We're showing more progress towards achieving that goal.
1,400 Ukrainians, did I hear that right?
Yeah, Minister Marcelino has done remarkable work in doing a seemingly gargantuan task of trying to get these immigration numbers lifted because of the way that they benefit our Manitoba economy. And when we think about the way that Manitobans stepped up and continue to step up about the war in Ukraine, I think, you know, this is something that a lot of people are going to welcome. I've traveled to cities and small towns across the province where you find newcomers who've arrived during Russia's illegal war and have been welcomed, are powering the economy, are doing great things. You know, we got the MMF AGA this weekend. They have an entire program in Selkirk of Ukrainian newcomers working in childcare in particular. So really just whether it's folks from Ukraine or people who are going to end up working in the vertically integrated pork manufacturing facilities, or if it's people who are going to help power the tech economy, immigration is an important driver of growth. It is one of the ways that we Trump-proof our economy. And you've got a really special immigration minister who's managed to do something that a lot of others didn't think was possible. Alors finalement, en français, il y a toujours la question de la laïcité, de la Constitution, des enjeux à ce niveau-là. Mais pour moi, c'est une question des droits des êtres humains. Alors ça, c'est pourquoi aujourd'hui, nous avons avancé le projet de loi 50 pour dire que n'importe quel gouvernement dans l'avenir ici dans le Manitoba aura une responsabilité de demander aux cours si ces actions seraient constitutionnelles s'il n'y avait pas cette section 33. Alors, j'espère que les autres premiers ministres, les autres gouvernements dans le Canada seront capables d'engager avec cette question. Est-ce que vos projets de loi engagera et respectera les droits des êtres humains? Sinon, peut-être vous devrez trouver une autre façon d'engager avec les politiques. Merci beaucoup.